and good afternoon. My name is Julia Hines, and I'm the Director of Corporate Relations at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thank you to all, and especially to the Chicago Council members and our corporate partner employees for joining us today via Zoom for a conversation on the future of global supply chains. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few brief housekeeping points. Please note the Chicago Council on Global Affairs is an independent and nonpartisan platform. Views expressed by those we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. For those who are tuning in right now, we'll be taking your questions in about 30 minutes. If you have a question for our panel, please submit or vote for your favorites at ccga.live, which you can type straight into your browser. Again, that link is ccga.live. I would also like to begin to express our gratitude to Blue Yonder for supporting and collaborating with us today on our conversation. If you'd like to learn more about ways to elevate your company's expertise and engage in a strategic partnership with the Council, please visit thechicagocouncil.org/corporate to learn more. Now on to our main topic for today. At the height of the pandemic, global supply chains faltered under unprecedented strain. From panic shoppers and empty shelves to shortages of personal protective equipment, the global movement of goods became headline news. But as lockdowns begin to slowly ease in many places, returning to business as usual, we are delighted to host an expert panel to unpack global supply chain resiliency, risk, technological adaptation, and what it would take to prepare for a post-pandemic global economy. Nicole DeHoratius serves as an adjunct professor of operations management in the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. Since joining Booth, she has taught executives in programs and companies around the globe, including but not limited to Fred Meyer, McDonald's, Target, Ulta Beauty, and Walmart. Andy Kettlewell is the Vice President of Inventory Management and Supply Chain Analytics at Walgreens. He also leads end-to-end supply chain and master data management and analytics, leveraging big data and AI to further drive supply chain and operational results. Girish Rishi serves as the CEO of Blue Yonder. During his tenure, Blue Yonder has launched a portfolio on the cloud that utilizes machine learning and insights from the intelligent edge and enabling companies to forecast supply and demand. Prior to his role at Blue Yonder, Girish also served at Tyco International and Motorola Solutions. Girish is also an alum of the Council's Emerging Leader Program. This distinguished panel will be in conversation with Vijay Vatheshwaran. Vijay is an award-winning senior correspondent and currently serving as the U.S. business editor at The Economist. In his tenure, he opened the magazine's Shanghai Bureau in 2012 and served as the China business editor and bureau chief. Thank you all again for joining the Council. And with that, I hand it over to you, Vijay.
Thank you, Julia. Hello, everyone. It's great to have such a distinguished group of speakers to talk about one of the really hot button issues of today, global supply chains, which are really the plumbing that undergird the global economy, that make things work for e-commerce, for multinationals, for how the world economy works. And we are at a moment of transition, perhaps crisis in global supply chains. But I wanted to start with giving some context. The globalization has been changing for a number of years. We went through a period from the 80s onwards, thanks in part to the communications and transport revolutions, where we saw a period of unfettered globalization, where multinationals extended supply chains, particularly deep into Asia, into China, as low-cost economies, low-cost labor, and manufacturing prowess and certain amounts of innovation prowess in areas like electronics manufacturing made them attractive centers. We all benefited in some ways, lower cost goods at Walmart and so on, but also multinationals, American multinationals gained an edge in terms of profitability, in terms of the ability to compete against rising stars from the emerging world. The question became over the last 10 years, how was this changing? And even before we saw President Trump with some of the trade friction in China that had created questions on global supply chains, tariff wars and so on, and before COVID disrupted things in an abrupt way, there were already signs that globalization was turning into slowbalization, as a recent cover story in The Economist put it last year. There were signs that we're beginning to see a move out of China. We're beginning to see regionalization, perhaps. We were already beginning to see the demand side, what could be called the Amazon effect, or the I want it all and I want it all now effect from consumer markets and consumer pull, changing the way that companies thought about their supply chains. And something we want to get into a little bit here, the advance of technologies as well as analytics and private sector knowledge on how to manage supply chains and gain visibility was beginning to change the way that companies thought about how they manage their supply chain. So this was all happening before Donald Trump became president, before the world became one of supply chain crisis. And so with this context, I want to ask our experts today to move the conversation forward, because now we've lived with COVID for some time. Companies have dealt with this. This is now a board level conversation. And again, in my 25 years as a business and economics reporter at The Economist, I have not seen supply chains discussed in the C-suite and in the boardroom as much as I have in the last 12 months. And clearly this is a time when highest level attention is being paid to how the operators, and not just the strategists at companies, are thinking about and shaping the future of multinational companies particularly. And let's gain some insight from our experts on our panel today. Girish, I want to turn to you first. One of the themes that emerges as speaking to CEOs and other high-level folks in business is the theme of resilience. People love to talk about how do we make supply chains more resilient. I know you have lots of clients in this space. You think about this a lot. You and I were talking about this long before COVID and so on. Can you give me your perspective on what does resilience mean in the context of global supply chains? And what does it not mean? What's not achievable? How far are we advancing on that conversation?
Yeah, good to be with you, Vijay, and as well as the Chicago Council once again. Now, let me start off by saying the apocalyptic scenarios of 6 months ago did not pan out. So as much as supply chain is changing, supply chain resiliency stood up. We were all packing bathroom tissue and baked beans in the house, and those days did not pan out. So I think great acknowledgement to the worldwide supply chain communities. We are well fed and our families are well fed. Two aspects around supply chain resiliency. One is, the cliched are all your eggs in the China basket? Is the source of your product so far away for cost arbitrage that you're exposed? And the second thing, more in contemporary times, your supply chain and your inventory is only as good as the data that you have on it from a real-time perspective. And those aspects, those two vectors, what drive supply chain resiliency. What's not possible is, I think, going back 30 years where everything is sourced locally, everything is manufactured locally. I don't think the pendulum goes back to that extreme.
So you put an interesting idea on the table, and that is the worst forecasts of gloom and doom didn't pan out, right? The supply chains were able to cope with the COVID shock better than people thought. Does this mean, therefore, that this is going to be forgotten? If you fast forward a couple of years from now, I've covered previous supply chain disasters, from the Icelandic volcanoes that disrupted transport, floods in northern Thailand, of course, that awful tsunami and earthquake that devastated Japan. We've had multiple warnings that affected the supply chains in cars or in electronics, multiple industries. Each time we heard supply chain experts, companies say, oh, never again, we must do something, let's have resilience built in. But typically what happened was people find out that resilience takes money, it costs something. And if you do it and your competitors don't, then you perhaps have a short-term competitive disadvantage, and the price of insurance is deemed not worth paying. Girish, what are the prospects that the lesson learned will be, it's not so bad, we can handle the next crisis too? Or do you think there are going to be long-term changes arising from this experience? And then I'll come to Nicole as well to follow up on this.
Sure. Vijay, we are not going back to February 15th ever. Internally in the company and with our customers, we are calling this a Copernican revolution, where world believed Earth was in the center, stagnant, the world revolved around us. That has flipped. The supply chain view that variances in data are inside the enterprise, not externally, has been flipped. The supply chain view of the past, that large stores is where our families and we will go to buy, is changing dramatically. The view of the past that one large distribution center in Memphis, Tennessee will serve the entire country, that's being changed. So we are seeing structural changes that are happening. And I don't see any possibility that we go back to February 15th.
Nicole, how do you see the question of resilience and how durable some of these changes will be?
I would hope that they would be durable, but I'm not as confident that we will persist. We've had these examples before. There's been terrible risks, and we end up focusing again back on just chasing after the cost. If we look over the course of the last 3 years, top management commitment to us managing supply chain risk has actually waned. It went from 49% to 21%. What I'm hoping this particular crisis has done is actually increase the attention on risk, exactly what you were saying, seeing more people in the boardroom and being able to manage risk. But I fear once they do start looking at the prices, if they're not measuring things like mismatch costs, which is the cost of stockouts, the cost of overages, if they're only focused on the unit cost of the good, we might end up ignoring all of these calls for change that we've seen recently.
And just to press a little bit further on this question about risk and resilience, folks who are concerned about climate change have long argued that companies are undercounting or not accounting enough for the potential risks from climate to their supply chain, be it low-lying factories or transit and transportation challenges and so on. And among the answers that I've heard from companies, supply chain managers and others, and risk managers is, it's hard to quantify exactly. I mean, we know it's out there, but how do you know exactly which factory where will be hit by what hurricane? Let's roll the die and let's see. We'll self-insure. That had been the attitude until fairly recently. That's one aspect of risk, right? It's the 100-year storm risk, let's say. Are you seeing with COVID raising the profile of thinking about various forms of risk on supply chain, thinking on climate also entering this conversation, or do you see that as a separate conversation that's being held by investors and ESG types and not so much by supply chain people?
No, I think supply chain, sort of the disruptions that can occur as a result of climate change, or the desire for the consumer to track and trace what their food supply chain looks like, or their pharmaceutical supply chain. I think that those desires are increasing and can actually help this initiative to manage supply chain risk. And what we tell folks in the supply chain community is the first thing you need to do is map your supply chain. And I'm always surprised that around 20% of the firms that were surveyed by the Business Continuity Index actually showed any sort of mapping beyond tier 1. The majority of people can't see and have no visibility beyond tier 2. And so what we're seeing now is folks that are interested in getting additional visibility down the chain because of the risk, but also the side benefits that could happen because of the climate change initiatives.
Thank you. Let me turn to Andy. Andy, we had some mention of demand and consumers just now. Can you tell me, from your perspective, if we turn from the risk story to maybe the opportunity narrative here, are there forces coming from consumer demand and changing patterns of how people shop and maybe e-commerce and some of the other things that you're seeing in your business that are also affecting how you're thinking about supply chain?
Absolutely, Vijay. And again, thank you to you for helping host this and for the council for having us here today. The consumer is center to the entire capitalistic economy, right? They shape the entire flow of goods. And what we've seen through COVID so far is an acceleration of underlying consumer forces that were already in the marketplace, right? So your shift into e-commerce forces or alternate fulfillment channels, or even how we engage with consumers in a more digital way, as Nicole was saying, with tracking and tracing packages and an awareness of what the status of an order is key to how the consumer expects to engage today. What we're also seeing an acceleration of in Walgreens and across all of the food, drug, and mass retailers is more intense, focused concentration shifts of consumer demand. And so using a recency bias, if you consider the great paper towel and tissue shortage of 2020, early, we saw consumers intensely focus purchasing power into very focused categories that, when we think about supply chain resiliency, are more like turning a battleship than a speedboat. We can't change it and retool factories as quickly as consumer demand changes. And when I really think about the consumer, the access to information and the free flow of information is at unprecedented highs. And so we see this magnitude or this amplitude impact of when news arises of either shortages and scarcity, as well as the need to utilize different products or services with much more intensity.
So just to take that example, the great toilet paper shortage, as it were, and more broadly, cleaning products and those sorts of things. If it's not too anecdotal, we can try to come up with what lessons they can learn. If we do see a future in which there might be, and not just because of crisis, but it could be social media and influencers, a particular SKU or a fashion takes off, and we see this with fast fashion, of course, but if you have a world in which that's more driven by short-term bursts of demand for particular products, not planning a year ahead, shipping things from your factory in China 9 months in advance, and so on, all those lag times, what implications are there? Does it mean, for example, you have to hold more stocks? Or does it mean you actually have to move your factories closer to market and have shorter turns, that is, rapid innovation loops, so you can respond quickly at the plant in response to new designs or new fashions and tastes? What are some of the implications that you predict we're likely to see as a result of this phenomenon?
You've absolutely mentioned two of them by far. So we're going to see more dynamic safety stocks or inventory holdings, right? Both as investment and divestment as quickly as demand patterns shape. And that'll happen through CPGs and manufacturing as well as retailers. The one element you did not mention, and as you were sharing that question, was really about redundancy and the ability to create an agile supply chain and network and switch, right? And that agility can come with how quickly can I turn over a line in a manufacturing plant to manufacture product A instead of product B, or how quickly can I move production from Asia Pacific over to North America if that's where the demand is shifting, and how do I flex my network appropriately? The other element that I would mention is really looking at the externalities that shape demand. And so a long history with retailing is the P's of retailing, right? The price, the promotion, the product, the placement drove the large majority of your consumer demand, and those are all internally controlled. As we move into a post-COVID world, those externalities, whether they're economic conditions or pandemics or natural disasters that seem to happen in the marketplace, or influencers or a news report, all have very, very meaningful impacts on demand and shaping that demand in almost the same effect as those P's of retailing do. And so retailers need to be equally focused on the internal factors that can shape consumer demand and meet consumer demand, as well as the external factors that are really shaping that consumer demand.
Girish, can you pick up on this idea of visibility? It sounds like companies need not only to know their own internals better, plan, source, make, deliver, but also these external factors. What are the tools that are now coming up that you think are really transformative that can help companies do this? And as opposed to a lot of the promise over the last 10, 20 years of revolution, but not a lot of change. We've had a few false trails in promised revolutions in supply chains. What do you think is really happening, and which technologies look the most interesting for this visibility question?
That's a great question. I'm sure Girish will want to chime in here as well.
Sure. I'm sorry. I was hoping Girish would, actually.
But let me pick up on what Andy said and the question that you asked, Vijay. Really, it's cloud and artificial intelligence is becoming quickly the table stakes. Cloud liberates data that is trapped in servers across multiple sites. And if you look at Walgreens, $130 billion retailer, I don't even know how many sites they have, right? So it's trapped. So cloud liberates it. Artificial intelligence is nothing more than a probabilistic approach where you can take a multitude of variables from the external environment, visibility oriented, where is my intermodal container, where is my inventory, what's my supplier status, but as well as internal seasonality, external news, health patterns, social media sentiment. How do you algorithmically take all that, compute it, and then build a pattern day by day, week by week that gives you greater visibility and greater accuracy? And I'm assuming that's where Andy was also going to go, but we are seeing that as a major trend across sectors.
Really,
one of the things about data sets is, garbage in, garbage out, right? We have seen with AI engines created by the Silicon Valley giants, for example, because of limits to their data set or the questions they were asking, how they were interrogating the data, they had certain kinds of biases that have been noted of late. Is there a relevant question here with supply chains where by working on prior paradigms or mindsets, you end up actually replicating problems of the past rather than anticipating a more disruptive world where you may not be able to predict where the problems are going to come from, as with COVID?
Yeah, Vijay, there's a segment of artificial intelligence, we reference it as machine learning. And machine learning is literally day by day, the machine becoming smarter. In the past, most companies looked at the last 20 years, back to school, seasonality, and planned their goods and demand. Now, given more than 50-70% of reliance is on external data, that machine learns day to day, and it improves, and it adjusts, and it becomes smarter.
Andy, I know you wanted to come in, and then I want to come to Nicole on this topic. Andy, sorry to have interrupted you. Please go ahead.
No, absolutely. I think Girish said it well with the federation of data and the ability to process vastly larger data sets are allowing us to bring in the externalities, like I mentioned. And AI is definitely one of those components. What we've noticed, and to be very tactically focused here, is the speed and the latency around those models. Many of those models are tuned, as Girish mentioned, around demand planning or stock allocation or how much you're going to manufacture, to take out the noise, to not respond to the highs and the lows. And as I talked about, the volatility around both supply availability and demand in the current marketplace requires us to retune those models to bias towards reacting a little bit more to those highs as well as those lows, and not move towards the middle ground for a homogeneous outcome, because that's really not going to satisfy the consumer demand and the stockouts that we see within the marketplace. And so, moving from a conservative to a more aggressive approach in those models will allow companies to be more resilient and responsive to then implement those agile changes of what they need to do within their network to respond.
Nicole?
Andy, I want to build off of that because it's these tools and the AI and the algorithms that you're talking about don't work without good data quality. And so firms actually have to do the heavy lifting that Walgreens itself has done and other retailers have done to actually get the data quality to be strong. Some of the research that's been done in our field shows that more than 65% of the records in retail stores are incorrect. And so if you're building your demand forecast off of those incorrect records, it gets to be challenging. So we can't forget, again, to go tactical, Andy, we can't forget how we have to have the firms focused on these particular aspects so that these amazing tools can actually work effectively and deliver on their promise. I also want to address, if it's okay, Andy, the other thing you brought up was about the agile and a resilient supply chain. And for so long, we've been teaching about creating a tailored supply chain. So for some of our products, they're short life cycle, a lot of variability in demand. We want to have an agile supply chain. But for the things like toilet paper and the beans, we want to have a very consistent, low-cost supply chain. And what we're seeing now is with this is how do I also build flexibility in the supply chains that traditionally were what we would call functional supply chains, ones that we, just let it run, pick low-cost providers, et cetera. So I like the focus on it's agile for a larger breadth of products than we've been talking about in the past.
Nicole, to stay with you and on the theme of technology, can you talk a little bit about other areas of technology that you think have the potential to really affect the questions we're addressing? For example, in my time in Asia, I've run across lots of factories adopting robotics with different levels of sophistication. Less so in the US, I've noticed. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what you think is the potential for different forms of robotics and other kinds of advanced automation in DCs and in warehouses and so on, and how that links up with the themes we're talking about.
Correct. So I agree with you that in other areas and other regions, we've seen a lot more automation than we've seen in the US. That has changed. So that is something that the COVID-19 has accelerated, is thinking more about how do I get robots in my DC. I've heard a lot about smart factories, so I can share information about visibility. And firms don't want every piece of information. They just want alerts when things aren't meeting particular milestones. So having these smart factories and having these milestones built in that automatically shares with your supply chain partners is important. So I think both of those, the robotics and then sort of the smart factories are two technology things that we will see. The obstacle, honestly, is trust. We still have an absence of trust in our supply chains where it is difficult and people are unwilling to share information. And breaking down the trust barriers is something that I think is even more challenging than the technology.
It's so interesting, your observation. I'm interested that you think that the pandemic may be leading American companies to invest more in this area, but it might be because of the human risk from the virus rather than the trust or faith in technology, as it were, that you see in Asia. The World Economic Forum follows the future of manufacturing closely, and they put out several reports on what they call lighthouse factories. That's their euphemism for advanced factories with lots of robotics, 5G connectivity, and so on, factories of the future. The first report that came out a couple of years ago had dozens of examples. The lion's share were in Europe. Almost all the rest were in Asia, and there was only one at that time. I'm pleased to say it was in Chicago, fast radius, that was named in that first report. They've done a follow-on report with a couple of more American examples, but clearly it appears that there has been more enthusiasm in Europe and Asia, often multinationals operating in China, not Chinese companies necessarily. And so maybe Girish, since you're close to some of the technologies, can you give us a sense, did they just get it wrong, or American companies are more secretive, they don't want to tell the World Economic Forum what they're doing? Or do you think there's something that you noticed among your American clients on the role of technology, robotics, and automation that's a little bit different that may explain this?
Yeah, Vijay, let me weave in what Nicole and Andy said earlier as well, but I'll share examples of two American companies, headquartered companies, and one European company. Becton Dickinson, who we've come to know really well, over a century-old company that provides medical equipment. We have worked with them to provide visibility and real-time data. The point that Nicole brought up about accuracy of data and resiliency of data itself is a very big point, because when you go real-time, if your data is not accurate, it can do havoc when you get visibility, as you can imagine. So Becton Dickinson is, we've helped them map where the infections are taking place from CDC and where their sites are, but globally to also give them visibility of where their medical kits are coming from overseas. That's one example. There's a retailer in the Mid-Atlantic area called Wakefern. They have a big customer loyalty over there in the New Jersey Mid-Atlantic area. And they are utilizing machine learning forecasting. Last time I checked, they had rolled out, as an example, dairy across their sites, and they're augmenting automation. They took people who were working on manual forecasting, diverted them to more critical tasks, while machine learning autonomous outcomes were driving more accurate outcomes. The last example I'd like to use here is DHL, who's deployed robotics, once again in a human augmentation approach. The last site we worked with them was in Madrid, Spain. So that's kind of the trend we are seeing. American companies are executing on that.
Great. I think we're just coming up on audience questions. And in fact, I have a Zoom chat line full of questions already, so I might turn to them. We have a first question that it looks like it's directed towards Andy. Studies show that low percentage of retailers worldwide have digitally ready supply chains, making it difficult for them to beat a path through COVID disruption. How do we get more retailers across the line? What do you think, Andy?
Well, there's two parts of that digitalization. I would call it the consumer-facing digital ready supply chain and really focusing on e-commerce, and then the back of the house digital operations, which can be an opportunity for many retailers. First, speaking about the consumer-driven side and the e-commerce, all retailers are growing in this space. Whether it's Amazon or Walmart or Walgreens, we continue to refine our consumer offerings and meet the customer where their needs are. You're starting to see that in the marketplace right now around the digital engagement with consumers to buy online, pick up in store, or even at Walgreens, pick up your prescription or a number of consumer products right from the drive-through, and all offerings that candidly were stood up by many retailers in the matter of months and weeks, where that kind of development in the past would have taken years. That's layered in the foundation of digitalization of the backbone of the supply chain. Everything from the real-time visibility to inventory to enable fulfilling customer orders in that way, to being able to parse and predict consumer demand of where and how that fulfillment will need to be. I'll go back to my nimbleness comment, is that after you have that kind of a backbone for readiness in retail, it's really around how you can be nimble in how you satisfy that consumer demand. How do I recover from a failure? Because they will happen, right? I will have a stock accuracy issue here or there on an item, or I might not be able to fulfill entirely a consumer order. So how do I recover from that as quickly and nimbly as possible is really how retailers will respond with their digital supply chains, enacting with and reacting to consumer demand digitally. But it really comes from a foundation, just like Nicole said, of you've got to get your foundational data right if you have any hopes of serving a digitally enabled customer who has access to more information than they ever have of stock outs and in stocks across multiple retailers, as well as pricing, so that you can get that engagement right.
Nicole, could you weigh in on this question about retail? And in particular, we're seeing a big emphasis on so-called omni-channel from Walmart, but many others as well, shop online, pick up in person, and so on because of COVID. Can you talk a little bit about any particular challenges that poses for supply chains for retailers?
So first, I just want to say I was really amazed at how well all the retailers adjusted to the environment and how quickly they ramped up all of the different alternatives. It was quite impressive. If you look at from grocery retailers, a classic example, Ganesh, I know you've used this before, is Tractor Supply, which in the Wall Street Journal said they had, they had a 10-year plan or a 5-year plan that they managed to get off the ground in 3 months. So these kinds of things are pretty amazing. The challenges really exist with how do you focus on speed, and how do you focus on the other attributes of delivery that matter to the consumer? So we've had an overwhelming emphasis on how quickly we can get it to the consumer, but the consumer also cares about other things such as, can I get it within a time window that I care about? So how precise can my delivery be? And part of the reason why we see the online pickup in the store is because the consumer can control the timing of that delivery, right? And then the other thing is flexibility. Can I receive it on a day that I want to get it? So we actually say that there's multiple dimensions of delivery, and I think overwhelmingly the firms have been focused on speed rather than on multiple dimensions. I do also want to pick up on something, the words that Andy used, which is consistency and recovery, right? He talked about being able to recover when there's some sort of delivery failure. But that happens not just at the retail level, but it's also how do the consumer products and the vendors to the retailers recover. And there is research that shows that vendors that are able to recover in the face of a stock out more quickly or more readily can actually steal market share from those that cannot. So designing into our supply chains these recovery capabilities is pretty important, and even more so now.
Girish, follow up on that?
Yeah, as I'm listening to Nicole, and I don't have data, but one thing I've been looking at hard is the customer want replacing customer loyalty? Am I going back to the same retailer? Am I going back to the same brand? And how resilient is customer loyalty in these times? And will that change going forward? Because I need it here and now. And if this portal or this online or this brand isn't going there, I'll go to somebody else. That's an area of wonderment for me and for the industry to study.
And there's long been a tension between brands and retailers, right? Whether it's the supermarkets that control the shelves and the P&Gs or Unilevers that advertise and control our affections. And if in this age of e-commerce and distribution, if the Amazons and competitors are the ones that I trust, I may switch from my Crest to my Colgate toothpaste if I think it's, or some other more serious product, where I care about the precise delivery timing. So your point is well taken, Girish. What does this do to loyalty of customers, and in a sense, it reflects what's important to us as consumers, and which may change because of these odd times that we live in, and some of our priorities. Let's push on to another question. There's a question that's asked, a challenging one about AI and robotics. An audience member wants to know if this really takes off, what will be the effect on the labor market? Don't we already have a problem of not enough jobs available for warehouse workers and truck drivers if we're going to replace them with robots? Somebody want to take that?
I can take it. It's not, for me, what I hope is that it's a different type of job, right? So Girish talked about actually complementing the work that's being done, similar to what we see in the car factory. We have a lot of automation in the car factory, but oftentimes it's in conjunction with the worker to help them lift something that's particularly heavy. What I think we need to see is different trainings. So we see some of the work by Andy McAfee at MIT talks about needing to have an increase in the skills required to maintain and to actually program the robotics. So it's a different skill set, and we do need to be thinking at an educational level, how do we train the future workforce to accommodate some of the automation that we'll be seeing.
We have a couple of questions that are touching on a theme that we didn't have time to get to, but I'm glad it's been brought up, and that is reshoring or nearshoring. The gist of the questions is that, because of the pandemics, as well as focus on resilience, are we seeing companies invest more in Mexico or other areas that could be considered nearshoring or reshoring? Andy, is this something you guys are thinking about?
So Walgreens partners with thousands of suppliers or vendors, as Nicole mentioned. And when I look across our supplier community, it's definitely an active discussion, but less in a binary way, like the question was posed of, do I manufacture here or there? It's really about how do I drive the right agility servicing the regions that I need to service. And so that might mean redundant manufacturing of SKUs across multiple sites so that you have the flexibility, or retooling factories so they can be more nimble and manufacture a wider array, still at the same productivity rates. And so there's been an evaluation on this topic for years. Every time a hurricane hits Puerto Rico, there's questions around the pharmaceutical manufacturing in the marketplace there, for example, or any natural disaster raises this kind of a question. And I really see most of the discussion, again, not a here nor there, because the risk exists globally, whatever risk you're talking about, whether it's natural disasters or pandemics or economic risks that do exist, but about how do I move to an insulated model where I have choice if I have to reallocate resources across the globe. And I think that really is the conversation that I hear and see across our manufacturing partners today, so that they can ensure continuity of supply regardless of the risks that are posed regionally and dynamically across the future years.
Nicole, sorry, Girish, go ahead. Yeah.
If I can add a point tagging on that one. And I agree with Andy, this is not a pendulum swinging from local to global for the last 2 decades to back to local. We are seeing a federated model of supply chains. We are also seeing that what was the case over the last couple of decades, where the supply chain leader, John or Mary, who ran supply chain for your enterprise, was perhaps unitarily looked at as the cost driver, the cost arbitrage person who was supposed to deliver more profit. Enterprises are realizing supply chain delivers customer experience. How good is your customer front-end portal if you're not able to fulfill that demand? So supply chain is a revenue driver, is a customer loyalty enabler. And as a result of that, redundancy, the word that Andy has used a number of times, I think will be prevalent in supply chains going forward.
So Girish, I want to press on that a little bit, because that cuts to one of the central tenets of supply chain thinking over the many years. It used to be that companies would relegate supply chain management to perhaps not certainly in the highest levels of the C-suite, but a supply chain manager, and say, cut costs 2% a year and we'll leave you alone. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not too much. If in fact we're flipping the paradigm, rather than seeing this as a cost center or something that manages costs, but rather something that creates opportunities, does it follow axiomatically that companies are now willing to invest more? To Nicole's earlier point about costs, or earlier skepticism about costs, are you seeing clients saying, we understand what you just said, that this is a way to improve customer experience and so on, and we're ready to put more money on the table into our supply chain?
You know, on a lighter note, the supply chain leader is the cool kid on the block now around the leadership table. Literally is. On a serious note, over the last 6 months, we haven't heard companies, in spite of being impacted by COVID-19, saying we are going to pull back on supply chain investments. This is a very active narrative where they know for them to survive, not just to thrive, this will be an area of investment now and going forward.
Okay, that's promising to hear. Nicole, you had a quick follow-up on that?
Yeah, I just want to make sure that we also understand with that investment has to come internal changes. So what are the KPIs that buyers in the organization face? Is it still going to be the total cost, where they're minimizing the cost in the supply chain, or are they rewarded for product availability? Are they looking at total landed cost? So I think this needs to go hand in hand with some internal changes so that everybody in the organization is aligned on what you're describing, Girish.
Yes, absolutely. Totally agree.
We have just a couple of minutes left. I want to ask each of you, if I might, to make a prediction. What do you think will be the toughest challenge that we need to overcome in the next 12 months as it relates to supply chain? And I'll put one out there. I'll channel one of our audience members who's already asked a question that I think we won't have time to get into, but that is about COVID vaccines. Once it's developed, it's something I write a lot about. I'm a former healthcare editor at The Economist. Scaling up and distributing a COVID vaccine or multiple COVID vaccines, which may be required with multiple dosages, with questionable durations on how long they'll be valid. It's going to be an enormous challenge. That's quite specific to healthcare and the pandemic. But if you were to look broader than that at the companies that you all work for, advise, and think about, what might be the biggest challenge going ahead in the next, let's say, year or two? I'll give you a little bit more time to think post-pandemic, hopefully. And we'll start with you, Nicole.
Of course you will. So I'm actually, when you asked that question there, I came back to the trust and the coordination. So I continue, the coordination and the ability to coordinate across multi-echelons of the supply chain has always been a problem. We saw it during the pandemic as well, where we really needed sort of an omniscient decision maker that could help everybody. Girish's federated supply chain, right? We needed that coordinated effort. I think that coordination is even more important, and I continue to think that it's a challenge due to misaligned incentives and a lack of trust in supply chains.
Okay, Andy, you're next.
Vijay, I appreciate that you time box that question to the next 12 months or so, because that makes it, I think, a little more straightforward to answer. I think it's one word: it's managing constraint within the supply chain. And so with the volatility and demand, we're seeing constrained manufacturing, and or constrained inventory availability that still permeates it within the market. You see it on your grocery shelves, you see it on even your Walgreens shelves in certain categories today. It's how firms manage that constraint. How do we allocate resources around manufacturing, or even last mile transportation constraints, right? When you think about courier delivery, to how we allocate even shelf space in a retailer based on the available inventory to satisfy that demand. And so throughout the end-to-end supply chain, from raw material availability through manufacturing, distribution to retail, and even fulfillment of retail, the management of that constrained resource is going to be the name of the game for most firms over the next 12 months.
Girish, what do you think?
Vijay, my two panel members covered it. I see the next 12 months, the biggest opportunity is end-to-end process change management. Cloud's there, autonomous is there, robots are there, but end-to-end process change management that drives growth and profitability for enterprises. Also delivers sustainability. You referenced climate. I think we need to have a bigger conversation around that.
So we've heard from our experts and had some challenges put forward. I'd just like to offer a final thought before I turn it over to the organizer, and that is this is a time of extraordinary challenges and constraints, as Andy just pointed out. But what I've observed, and having written lots about innovation, my last book was about the future of innovation, I have noticed extraordinary amount of innovation among the companies that are succeeding. Now, there are always companies that fall behind in crises, but among those who are winners and who are aspiring to be winners, what we're seeing is an accelerated pace of innovation. Projects and products that were seen as decade-long projects, or something that you tried out during your cool innovation weekends and workshopping and then put back on the shelf, they're being dusted off and implemented within a matter of weeks and months, as we've heard. So I see this as an extraordinary opportunity for accelerating trends that were already underway, whether it's technology adoption, business model change, or process change, or mindset change, but also to embrace something perhaps even more radical, not just what was already on the shelf, but stepping out of your previous thinking to find new opportunities, do what you thought your organization couldn't do. So that's my challenge to those of us on this call, the many of you on this call who joined us, whom I thank very much for being with us and contributing to the conversation with your questions. I see this as both a crisis, but one that can turn into great opportunities for your organizations. With that, allow me to thank my fantastic panelists and all of you at the gathering here today, the gathering of intellects and ideas, which I always appreciate, and bring this meeting to a close. Thank you.